Good morning. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. I'm Sarah Rose, Vice President of Education and Programs here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. We are just so excited for this symposium this morning. A big call out to Jonas Akins, one of our speakers. It was Jonas who inspired me by an article in The Economist in December of 2015 titled FinTech. I had just arrived at the Whaling Museum about 6 months before, and I was really working hard to figure out why whaling was relevant, and the article just totally spoke to me. So Jonas, thank you. He's been instrumental in getting some of our other speakers here, which I will introduce in just a moment. I also want to mention that this lecture series is in partnership with the Roach-Jones Duff Museum and Garden, and we will be heading up there after Jamie Jones finishes her lecture for a tour and then a really lovely reception in their back garden. So I encourage you at the end of the lectures to join us up at the Roach-Jones Duff House. It will certainly be a treat. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's going to talk about whaling as a business, its finance, organization, and management. Eric Hilt is an associate professor of economics at Wellesley College and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge. He received his PhD in economics in 2002 from Columbia University and has taught economic history at Wellesley since then. His work analyzes the organization and governance of American business enterprises and has written extensively on the whaling industry and on other early industries, particularly banking and finance. His papers have been published in a wide variety of business history, and economic journals, including the American Economic Review and the Journal of Political Economy. In 2009, he was the winner of an Economic History Association's Arthur Cole Prize for the best paper in the Journal of Economic History. In 2011-2012, he won a Visiting Scholar Fellowship at the Russell Sage Foundation, and in 2014-2015, he was a Visiting Associate Professor in the Economics Department at Yale University. I don't think I need to say a lot more other than welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Thunderous, my mic. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for the invitation, Sarah. Technical difficulties.
There you go.
How are we doing? Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Great. So as was said, my talk is called Whaling as a Business. And I've included on the first slide here a broadside from a very interesting whaling business, the Cold Spring Whaling Company, which is a business that probably, if you think about whaling here in New Bedford, you've never heard about or thought of, but it was a whaling corporation organized in a small port called Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island, and it was not very successful. Okay? And so what I'm going to do in this talk is compare corporate whaling ventures to sort of more traditionally organized whaling ventures and think about what that comparison reveals about how businesses were organized, how these whaling businesses were organized, and what was important to their success. So I want to start us off by comparing two whaling voyages that were extraordinarily similar. Okay, the first one is the voyage of the George and Susan of New Bedford, which is a ship built in 1810, 306 tons. Its captain in its 1841 voyage was Alexander Howland, and the agents who managed the voyage were George and Matthew Howland, who were also the sole owners of the vessel. Okay, so this is a traditional New Bedford whaling venture. Okay, it sailed on October 17th, 1841, as I said, bound for the Pacific in search of sperm whale oil. The other voyage I'd like to compare it to, which sailed on August 1st, 1841, just 2.5 months earlier, in a ship that was about the same size, 328 tons, built in 1811, is the series of Wilmington, Massachusetts. Now, if you went on board the series, this is a ship that had sailed from New Bedford several times, you wouldn't really notice anything different. You wouldn't think it was very different compared to the George and Susan of New Bedford. Same number of crew members, same sort of organizational structure. They were working on the same contracts. The captain of the vessel was Edward Ayers. This was his second whaling voyage. The agent was a person called Thomas Young in Wilmington, Delaware. But the difference, the major difference between the George and Susan and the series is that the series was owned not by sort of a small partnership or a small number of closely related investors, but by a corporation. The corporation was called the Wilmington Whaling Corporation. It had 176 shareholders, mostly located in the Wilmington, Delaware area. So I wanted to find portraits of these ships. I couldn't find portraits, but I actually could find scrimshaw that depicts these two ships. So sperm whaling voyages, you see a lot of scrimshaw carved into sperm whale teeth. And so the series is on the right, and the George and Susan is on the left. It's not clear whether these scrimshaw were done on these particular 1841 voyages, but they're both from voyages around this time into the Pacific. So how did these voyages go? The George and Susan was quite successful. So it returned about 45 months later with about 1,600 barrels of sperm whale oil. And the series of Wilmington, Delaware, not so much. So they came back with about 550 barrels of sperm oil, having spent the same amount of time at sea with a ship of about the same size and a crew of about the same number of people. So the difference in terms of the market value of their cargoes when they returned was about $29,000 in 1845, and in today's money, adjusting for inflation, that's about $950,000. So the financial difference in terms of the success of these voyages was extraordinary. So our question for today is why? Okay, was it bad luck for the series or good luck for the George and Susan? Maybe that's part of it. Was it differences in the crew? Probably not. Okay, in terms of like the number on board, maybe a few of the officers were less experienced, but basically, as I said, if you looked on board, you wouldn't see many major differences. What about the captain's experience? Well, the captain of the George and Susan, that was his first voyage as captain, so that's probably not it. Was Wilmington the wrong place to pursue whaling? You know, it's certainly closer to the Pacific Ocean than New Bedford by a little bit. But it was a small port where there wasn't much whaling going on, and it was probably the sort of place where there wasn't good information about how to pursue a whaling voyage well, or what sort of current conditions in the industry were. But I think the most significant difference was that the management of the business that organized the voyages was different. Okay, so the George and Susan was owned 100% by the managers sponsoring that voyage, right? The two Howland partners owned that vessel completely. And that meant they had they had an enormous amount of their own money invested in this business, and they had very, very strong incentives to manage it in the best possible way, to diligently go out and hire the best possible crew members, to diligently and assiduously pursue information about the best places to send the vessel, and so on. The series of Wilmington was completely different. So the person who was actually organizing the voyage, known as the agent, whose name again was Thomas Young, he was not an owner of the vessel at all. Okay, so this is a corporate whaling voyage where the manager is paid his salary. Thomas Young was paid a salary of $75 a month, which was a pretty good income at the time. But because he wasn't an owner, he had no financial stake in the outcome of the voyage. He probably didn't have as strong an incentive to work as hard as possible to organize it in the best possible way, right? He's getting his $75 a month irrespective of whether the thing goes well or doesn't go well. Now, the organization of the business was not the only difference between the two, but it was probably a very important one, okay? So as I'm going to argue, most whaling businesses were organized in a very particular way. It evolved over time in response to changes in the industry, but the critical thing about it was it provided very strong managerial incentives. Okay? The investors, the managers of whaling voyages traditionally were also the investors, or among the largest investors in the industry. So the series was owned by a corporation organized in a very different way, which enabled small investors to hold shares in the ships, but which created significant incentive problems for management, in the sense that you have this problem where the people actually organizing the voyages don't have terribly strong financial incentives to ensure that they go well. So this comparison of these two voyages can only tell us so much. Okay, if you really want to understand the role of managerial incentives in whaling voyages, you need to study a much larger number of voyages in order to make sort of systematic comparisons. Later in this talk, I'll actually show you the results of a study that does exactly that. So what I'm going to do today in the time that I have with you is to talk about the history of the organization of whaling business enterprises and how it evolved over time, and how this sort of traditional model of organizing a whaling business came about and what it looked like. And then we'll talk about the innovation of the corporation in American whaling, why it occurred and what its significance was. And lastly, as I mentioned, I'll show you the results of a study that systematically compared corporate whaling voyages to sort of traditional whaling voyages. Okay, so the earliest offshore sort of deep sea whaling that occurred in what became the United States began sometime around the middle of the 18th century or so. It was pursued in small vessels, 30 to 50 tons, crews of 12 or 13. So here's a famous lithograph depicting one of these sort of whaling ventures, such as they were. The voyages would just go out for a few weeks. I think usually they would actually kill whales and tow them back to shore. So I think that's in the background of the picture, there's a try-works there over to the right. And the way that this business worked, it wasn't terribly capital intensive. The vessel is small. The outfit isn't that complex or expensive. They only need supplies for a couple of weeks. Typically, the key to the success of these voyages, or these ventures rather, is how hard are the crew working. And so the crew are paid in shares based on their ranks. And in total, those shares get them about half the proceeds of the voyage. Okay? The owners of the vessel would keep a quarter of the proceeds, and the investors who would pay for the outfit and the supplies for the voyage would keep another quarter of the proceeds. So we just have profits being divided up, right, with the crew taking the lion's share. Okay, so very quickly, over the late 18th century and into the 19th century, the character of American whaling voyages changed as these ventures went off into more distant oceans to pursue different populations of whales. First the Atlantic and South Atlantic, and then the Indian Ocean and Pacific, and ultimately the North Pacific and the Arctic. So to go on these longer voyages that might last 2, 3, 4, or more years, you need a larger vessel, larger crew. It's much, much more capital intensive and much riskier. Okay? So with these 300-ton plus vessels that are 10 times larger by capacity than the ones that I showed you earlier, you need much more capital and you're bearing much greater risks. Okay? And so the organization of these later ocean-going voyages differed somewhat. So in addition to an investor who might own the vessel, a number of other investors were typically brought in as co-owners of the vessel to help finance the voyage, and who would bear the cost of the outfit of the voyage sort of in proportion to their ownership shares. So in these voyages, there's a separation often between the ownership of the vessel and the management of the voyage. So the management was delegated to a partner called the agent, who would handle hiring the crew, purchasing the outfit, corresponding with the captain, supervising the voyage, and so on. So these agents emerged in ports that specialized in whaling, and they were sort of expert managers in whaling. And importantly, it was typically the case that these agents were the largest investors in the voyages that they managed. So when you see a vessel sort of sponsored by a particular agent firm, you almost automatically know that that agent firm is a major investor in the voyages that are being pursued. The crew continued to be paid in shares. There's, of course, the famous lay system where crew members on whaling voyages received incentive contracts. But the relative share that was received by the crew of the outfit shrank considerably in response to the sort of greater capital intensiveness of these later voyages. Okay, so this is what a traditional whaling venture looks like. You have, on average, about 9 investors who own shares in the vessel and are funding the outfit and so on. They're delegating the management of the voyage to agents. It might be an individual. It's more typically a partnership firm that is specializing in managing whaling voyages. And those agents are typically the largest owners in the vessel. So on average, from the data that I've collected for a few major ports, they own about 1/3 of the vessel. So they have very, very strong incentives to manage their voyages as diligently as possible. Okay, so another important element of this sort of traditional model of whaling is that there's a fair amount of specialization in whaling. So the most productive agents, the ones who are managing lots and lots of voyages, the ones who are the best at it, they tend to reside in a small number of major ports where almost all economic activity was dominated by whaling. So those ports included, for example, Nantucket, Sag Harbor, New York, New London, Connecticut, and also, of course, New Bedford. So those specialized whaling ports were hubs of information where the latest conditions could be found out and information was shared among different captains and returning crews. They also had many firms that were specialized in producing and distributing the supplies that are necessary for whaling voyages. So these are ideal places to be launching whaling voyages. Over time, you can see this is the total number of whaling voyages from 1800 to 1870 leaving from American ports. The dashed lower line is the major ports, those 4 major ports that I mentioned earlier. From about 1800 to, let's say, about 1830, almost all American whaling came from those major ports. And the earlier you go, the more it's focused on Nantucket. But as you can see, after 1830, between in particular 1830 and 1860, there's this huge increase in whaling that's coming from other ports. So many, many small ports suddenly joined the whaling industry at that time. And the total number of voyages from those places almost rivaled the total number of voyages from the major ports, right? And as we'll see, the corporate form, the use of the corporation was an important part of that trend towards whaling voyages from these obscure, smaller whaling ports. Okay, so the traditional organization of whaling ventures had its limits, and this is why experimentation with other forms was attempted, in particular in other small ports. So first of all, in the traditional model, as I said, there's 9 owners, which means that at a minimum, on average, the smallest investment is 1/9 of a whaling ship. So if the ship and outfits might cost between $30,000 and $50,000 all in for a whaling voyage, 1/9 of that is a huge sum, far larger than average incomes in any of these ports. So the minimum investment necessary to join one of these ventures was enormous, and for all intents and purposes, ordinary people could not participate as investors in the whaling business. It was sort of like a closed circle of very, very wealthy specialized investors, and there's a relatively small number of people sort of joined those circles by successfully operating as a captain on voyages and ultimately becoming an investor, for example. So whaling ventures in ports without a lot of experience in whaling probably struggled to raise capital from investors in the traditional model, asking an investor for maybe $10,000 commitment to a whaling voyage in 1835, something like this. It's a tremendous amount of money, and it made alternative organizational schemes relatively attractive to pursue. Okay, so this is where the corporation comes in. So just very quickly, what is a corporation? A corporation is a legal form of organization that creates a business that is a separate entity in the eyes of the law. It offers, most of the time, tradable shares, right? So shares can be transferred among investors. It offers investors what's called limited liability, which means that if the business that they invest in borrows a lot of money and loses it, the creditors can't come after that investor's personal assets. And it also offers a formal governance structure where decisions are made by votes from the shareholders, typically for the composition of the board of directors, who sort of supervise management and so on. So we're all familiar with businesses organized as corporations today, but in the 19th century, they were relatively rare. Okay, so according to the doctrines of early American law, to form a corporation in the early 19th century, the state government actually had to pass a law granting a corporate charter to that business. So it's not, you couldn't just simply assert yourself as a corporation. Today, if you want to form a corporation, just fill out a form at the Secretary of State's office and pay a nominal fee and you become one. At this time, it's a very, very big deal to become a corporation. But over the course of the 19th century, and particularly around the 1830s and 40s, became relatively more accessible and more common. So you start to see more and more corporations being formed in American business, and that trend spreads into whaling. And so you start to see whaling corporations being formed, particularly in the smaller and more obscure whaling ports. So here's an example of how the process worked. This is the bill submitted to the legislature of the state of Maryland to establish the Baltimore Whaling Company. So obviously Baltimore is not a small city, not a small port, but there was absolutely no whaling going on there at the time that this corporation was created, and some investors decided to form one, so they submit a bill to the legislature. It was ultimately passed. They were granted a corporate charter, and then you have the Baltimore Whaling Corporation created. So why do you want to do this? Why do you want to go through all the trouble to create a corporation in whaling? And so from some of the discussion in the press at the time in the places where these corporations were proposed, you can actually see some analysis. So the Delaware State Journal, which was a big, strong advocate for the Wilmington Whaling Company's formation, they said the number of persons engaged in the association, which was in the hundreds, renders it absolutely necessary to obtain an act of incorporation to conduct the business. They're saying if we're going to have hundreds of investors, we need a corporation so that we can have this formal governance structure and a board of directors and so on, and represent everybody's interests fairly. They continue, an additional motive is to secure that degree of credit and confidence in the association, which will then enable them to increase their capital and extend their businesses advantageously. So the corporate charter also gives the business kind of the official imprimatur of like state, not necessarily sponsorship, but state recognition at least. That might, in the eyes of these corporate founders, make the business more credible to investors. Okay, so in searching through the state laws for these corporate charters, I found about 18 whaling corporations created between the early 1830s and the mid 1840s. Some of them are in major cities like Brooklyn and Baltimore, but none of them, except for one in Fall River, are in cities that had any amount of whaling going on a significant scale. So these are ventures that are being created sometimes by civic boosters, sometimes by merchants sort of interested in the whaling business to facilitate like the expansion of the whaling industry where they're located. There's several along the Hudson River in New York. That's the North River Whaling Company. There's also the Poughkeepsie Whaling Company and the Dutchess Whaling Company in Poughkeepsie. But you know, it's as far north as Wiscasset, Maine, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and as far south as Wilmington, Delaware, and Baltimore, Maryland. So all these relatively small places without a lot of whaling going on are forming whaling corporations. And so you actually see, you know, in some cases that shares of stock in these businesses still survive in one form or another. So here's the share of stock of the Staten Island Whaling Company and the Wilmington Whaling Company and so on. So these are tradable shares, and if you find examples of them in archives, you can see where they were, you know, on the back they're typically transferred. If someone sold the share, you can see evidence of lots of transfers, lots of trading in these shares. So this is very, very different than a business in which you just own a share of the ship, which is very illiquid and very large and hard to sell, right? These shares, in principle, facilitate easy transfer of shares. Another thing about the corporate form that's different is you have a somewhat greater sort of public accountability of the business. So these private agency firms, these partnerships that are managing whaling voyages in places like New Bedford, they don't release their returns or anything, accounting statements to the public in any way. They're a purely private business, accountable only to their private investors. But these corporations are public businesses, and some of them are actually legally obligated to make public statements of their returns. So this is a balance sheet for the Wilmington Whaling Company. It's a terrible copy because I've taken it off microfilm from the Delaware State Archives. But you can see they're showing to investors and to the public what their financial returns are, which is a significant change in the way whaling businesses were conducted. So these corporations, they did not deviate from the traditional model in terms of the labor contracts that were used. So the sailors on board the vessel were not paid in salaries or something like that. They received share contracts. They received lays similar to traditional enterprises. But these corporations, the main difference was that they solicited small investments from large numbers of investors. Some of the corporations actually did not include huge numbers, you know, maybe a couple of dozen of investors. Others had hundreds of investors. So the average number that I found was about 41 investors. They retained the position of the agent, the sort of managing partner who's organizing and supervising the voyages. But this agent would now report to a board of directors and was typically paid either a salary or in some cases like a so-called cost-plus contract where they purchased everything for the voyage and got a percentage of that cost. So we have a rather different organizational structure of these enterprises. On the left is the traditional model that we've already seen. On the right is what we have in a corporation. So there's, on average, 41 investors, sometimes many more. They elect a board of directors who sort of represents their interests, and the board of directors in turn hires an agent to manage the voyage and pays that agent a salary. Sometimes the agents were investors, but on average the agents were about 1% owners. So going from 1/3 owners to 1% owners is a very, very significant change in the ownership incentives of the actual managers who are conducting these voyages, the agents. Okay, so these whaling corporations were not successful. None of them lasted for more than 6 years. Their shares offered negative rates of return. If you bought investments in a whaling corporation, in any of them, you lost money. It's, the question is simply how much. And the issue that's interesting to me as an economic historian is why. Okay, so was it that the corporate form actually caused lower productivity? Okay. Whaling corporations, as I said, were located in obscure ports. These are places without good access to information, possibly places where you could only get access to lower quality supplies. That might have been part of it. Whaling corporations often hired crews that were less experienced, not the captains and the officers. They would typically recruit those from the major whaling ports. So the Wilmington, Delaware whaling corporations hired several New Bedford captains and officers to run their voyages. But the rest of the crew and maybe some of the boat steerers and so on were less experienced. The agents themselves managing these voyages were typically less experienced and also probably less competent, right? There's a sense in which if they were really, really good at managing whaling voyages, they wouldn't need to be part of the corporation. They could just sort of do it on their own. And so what these things imply, I think, are that, these whaling businesses organized by corporations, we wouldn't expect them to be terribly successful even if they weren't organized as corporations, right? They have a lot of strikes against them. They're operating out of the wrong places, and they're being managed and operated by the wrong people, okay? But nonetheless, it could be the case that the corporate form contributed to this difference in productivity. Okay, so the approach that I've taken, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to show to you very briefly the result of a study of a very large number of whaling voyages, is to focus on agents who manage whaling voyages in traditional ventures and then later manage them in corporations. And if the corporation failed, often they went back to managing them in the traditional ventures, right? And so what I want to do is compare whaling voyages managed by the same people in the same ports under different organizational structures. So we have the same agent managing a traditional whaling voyage, and then a corporate voyage, and then in some cases, not always, a traditional voyage again. So if there's differences in productivity within that same person's voyages, we can rule out the possibility, we can rule out the possibility that the competency of the manager is responsible for the poor productivity, right? Because it's the same manager. And we can rule out the possibility that it's, they're just operating out of the wrong port, because it's the same port, right? So what I did was I went into a lot of different archives and collected customs records for the returns of a very large number of whaling voyages, and found voyages that fit the profile of being managed by an agent who was both involved in traditional voyages and in corporate voyages. Okay, so this is what the results of that study look like. I don't want to go into detailed numbers here, but I'll just point out a few. So what we have is statistics of the characteristics of voyages sort of managed by corporations on the left and managed by the traditional unincorporated ventures on the right, always by an agent who was involved in both. Okay, so the first row just summarizes the age of the vessels used. They're about the same. Okay, so there's no difference in the vessel that you choose to use if you're a corporate manager or an agent for a traditional venture. The vessel size is slightly smaller for the corporation, but about the same. The captain's experience, slightly different, but pretty similar. They went to the Pacific Ocean slightly more frequently for corporations. I think probably they preferred to go after sperm whale oil at slightly higher rates, but that certainly doesn't explain the difference. And so you can see the specialization of sperm whales a little bit higher. Voyage length is slightly longer for corporations, but not terribly different. And then what I have here is the voyage productivity index. So this is a measure I constructed where I take the value of outputs and divide it by the value of inputs. The absolute number isn't important, but what's important is the relative comparison. It's about 20% lower for the corporate voyages relative to the unincorporated voyages. So the same person manages a voyage under a corporation. Their voyage produces about 20% less relative to the inputs they're using compared to the voyages that they themselves managed in a traditional model. Okay, so what are the conclusions we can reach from this? Firstly, whaling was a business that was dominated by closely held ventures. Relatively small numbers of investors who often knew one another and invested relatively large sums of money to sponsor these voyages. So it was a closed world. It was one that was not accessible to ordinary people, but it was a very, very successful one because it provided high-powered incentives to the managers involved. The corporate form, on the other hand, was not successful. Okay? It offered some important democratic possibilities. It enabled small investors to participate in owning these voyages, and it enabled small ports to actually enter the business when they might not have been able to otherwise. But at the time, the organizational technology to make the corporate form work in whaling didn't really exist. They couldn't figure out how to provide strong enough managerial incentives to facilitate successful operation of corporate managed whaling voyages. So as I said, the likely cause of this productivity differential is incentive problems. So how do we reconcile this with the prevalent use of the corporate form today? Why did corporations fail in whaling when they succeed in tech businesses, heavy industry, and so on today? Well, I think there's several answers to this. Firstly, over time, as the corporate form became more common, sort of better management systems were developed. Investors, corporate promoters, corporate organizers learned how to structure a corporation with strong incentives for the people operating it. So they got better at adapting the form into different industries successfully. Second thing, in some industries, the corporate form offers some advantages that don't seem to exist in whaling, or at least didn't exist in the early 19th century. So for example, in industries like steel, it's very, very important to have enormous scale, just tremendously large scale, because there are what economists call economies of scale. The larger you are, the lower your unit costs. Okay? So that provides an advantage to the corporate form that might sort of offset these managerial problems if your business may not be quite as well managed, but you've been able to achieve this efficient scale that is actually necessary for success. In whaling, that's not the case. Okay, so there were no differences between corporate whaling vessels and unincorporated whaling vessels. There's no difference in scale, right? So if it were possible, for example, this is obvious, but if it were possible to have absolutely enormous vessels that were much more productive or something like that, then maybe the corporate form, to the extent that it could have enabled investors to actually purchase those vessels, those huge vessels, might have actually had some advantages. And lastly, of course, it's worth remembering that some industries today do not use the corporate form, right? And those industries might have something in common, in a way, with whaling. So for example, law firms are typically organized as partnerships, not corporations. Doctors' offices are often partnerships, and until relatively recently, in historical time, investment banks were typically organized as partnerships. So these are service-oriented firms where professional incentives need to be very strong. They don't use the corporate form in the same way that the whaling industry typically did not use the corporate form. Okay, so that's all I've prepared. I'm delighted to take questions in the remaining time we have. How much time do we have, by the way? Okay, 10 minutes of questions if everybody has any. Yeah.
It seems to me the whole element of personal risk was tied in with incentive. If somebody was working for a personal group of 3 or 4 people, he might take the extra risk of staying out and going after a whale or on a whale that you don't feel in corporation. Do you think it may come down to that element of risk-taking plus personal incentive?
So that's an interesting observation. I don't know that everybody heard that, but the claim that I'm making is that if I own more of the vessel, I have a stronger incentive to manage it well. And the observation that was just made was that maybe I also know my other co-investors and I feel responsible to them to a greater extent, and therefore I'll try harder and take on more risks. I think that's perfectly plausible. It's certainly, this is something that, as an economist, I like to try to document things as comprehensively as possible and be very conservative about the kind of conclusions I draw. So documenting whether or not investors knew one another or were related is very difficult when all you have is their names, and sometimes they're related by marriage and so on. But I'm sure it is the case that, on average, in traditional whaling voyages, the investors were either related to one another or knew one another. And those sort of social ties almost certainly added to the incentives of the managers to work hard. So I think you're exactly right. It's just something that I can't measure. Over here, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly in your presentation that corporations have limited liability, and yet in the case study that we're looking at,
Okay, so sometimes they're...
in the early days they didn't have that.
Right.
So my question is, could that be part of the reason why the corporations failed?
Okay, so sometimes they were denied it, and sometimes they were granted it. Yes, so if corporate investors did not have the protection of limited liability, that might have affected their incentives. But remember, that just meant that their legal standing with respect to their creditors was the same as in a traditional voyage, right? So that can't account for this whole difference, right? So the question was, as I said, in the early voyages, about half the proceeds went to the crew. And in the later voyages, it fell. And the question was, how much? How much did the crew receive from these later voyages relative to the earlier voyages? Now, I have to qualify my answer by saying that the accounting changed as well. And so what the crews were paid was not just out of the gross proceeds, but it was out of a net calculation where some costs were subtracted. So that makes it a little bit difficult to make the direct comparison. But in the later voyages, the captain would get about 6%, the first officer maybe 4%, the second officer 3%, and so on. And the total going to the crew of those net proceeds was probably around 20-25% or less in some cases. So it fluctuated a lot. So it is certainly the case that from the standpoint of the green hands, who might have been recruited from far away from the coast, they might not fully have understood what they were getting into. And you hear these stories, maybe apocryphal, where someone is offered 1/300th share, and they bargain their way up to a 1/350th share, right? So yes. Now, having said that, I think there's a very significant difference between the officers and the sort of, especially the unskilled, maybe uninformed crew people. So I think the officers knew very well exactly what their shares were, exactly what it would translate into in money, wages, and what a good share would be, and a very skilled, successful boat steerer or mate or captain could negotiate for a pretty good share. So remember, although the percentage that they're getting is relatively small, these 4-year voyages bringing back 1,500, 2,000 barrels of sperm oil in some cases, that's a great deal of money that they're taking a small share of, right? So their incomes were not great, but they were not too bad either, especially for a good voyage.
I have a question, and I got the microphone.
Okay.
I have a question about the job description of the agent in a
Okay.
corporation.
Yeah.
And his authority. We
Uh-huh.
know that when you're the principal investor in a voyage, you have a lot of say in what happens.
Right.
When you are a hired hand, and I've looked at Fall River very carefully,
Uh-huh.
the people who were the board of directors didn't have the faintest notion
Right.
about running a whaling voyage.
Right.
And so I don't know how strongly they were calling the shots and saying, hire Joe Blow because he's my buddy. The number of captains who were hired in Fall River who served only one voyage, who'd never served before and never served again, suggests to me that there was something more than just understanding of the whaling industry that was causing this to happen. And I wonder how many other times this happened in corporations where, in fact, the board of directors were calling the shots.
That's right. So the board of directors is officially in control of the enterprise. And as was just said, it's often the case that these are sort of local business leaders, civically well-known people and so on. They're certainly not whaling experts. And so my interpretation of that is, in a corporation, it's probably the case that the agent has relatively more power, more discretion to decide sort of how to operate the voyage, how to who to hire, where to send the vessel, and so on. So the agent has more power, and my interpretation, so I think that's a perfectly valid observation. I think that's probably right. And in terms of the statistical comparisons I'm making here, I think what that means is it makes the incentives of the manager to do, the agent to do their job well, even more important. Because they're not accountable to any whaling experts and they have a lot of discretion. So if they do their job really poorly, the problem is being compounded by lots of bad decisions being made and no oversight by anyone else. Okay, over here, yeah?
Just a minute, let me give you the mic, sir.
Okay, the mic's coming around.
What was the incentive for these obscure ports or smaller ports, as you've mentioned, to encourage forming these corporations?
Okay, so let's go back. Where'd it go? So the whaling business in the 1820s, especially in the years following the War of 1812, was very, very lucrative. Okay, so these voyages in the 1820s here, which are mostly coming from Nantucket, are making excellent returns. And in the eyes of someone in Poughkeepsie, New York, where there actually is a tradition of whaling that precedes the corporation, or Wilmington, Delaware, or Baltimore, or Brooklyn, New York, that looks like a great industry to get in on, right? They're earning, this is the energy industry of the time, and they're striking it rich. They're hitting gushers here, right? And earning tremendous returns. So they want to get into this industry, and they don't necessarily know how. They don't have the expertise, and there's capital there, but probably the local capitalists, if you want to think of them that way, the local merchants, are reluctant to commit huge amounts of their own money to a business that they don't know anything about. So that makes the corporate form an attractive vehicle for facilitating that entry into this apparently very lucrative business. Now, as we'll see later today in the case that Jonas co-wrote, there's a huge amount of variability in the returns to whaling voyages, and to some extent they were misguided in their belief that just entering the whaling business was the key to riches, something that could enable you to get rich quick, because it was very, very risky and went through many periods where returns were really, really bad. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, we have someone here.
Okay, sure.
Regarding the capitalists, the guys that put up the money to build the vessel
Right.
to begin with, how did their share shake out versus the operating guy, the agent, or I'm not quite clear whether the agent also
yes.
owned the construction of the vessel. So if you could go into the
Yes,
capital
sure,
side.
absolutely. So everybody who's an investor in these voyages owns a share of the vessel itself. Okay, so there's typically 9, on average, here in New Bedford, there's about 9 investors. One of those investors is the agent, the person operating the voyage. The agent handles all the accounts, purchases the supplies, and so on, and charges the other investors for that, right? So everybody is contributing pro rata based on their investment in the vessel for the outfits, the supplies for the voyage. So they're all bearing those costs. In addition, the agents who are running everything will charge a management fee of one kind or another for their services, right? But they're all bearing those costs equally. Equally in the sense of relative to their ownership stake in the vessel. So the key is you have this, and it's actually something that was not enjoyed in other businesses, other kind of partnership firms at this time. You have this vessel that is the basis of the business, and by dividing shares in the vessel, you have something like a capital stock and divisions that most partnerships don't have. So you could own 1/32 or 2/32 or something like that of the vessel, and therefore have that share of the venture by also paying for the cost of the outfit and so on in proportion to your investment in the vessel. Yes?
Did the Dutch or the English, who had a longer history of using corporations, use that corporate model at all in whaling?
Yes, so there are some very large, I know English whaling corporations. They weren't as specialized and they weren't as small, but it's a little bit difficult to compare them to the American model because they're sort of pursuing things relatively differently. Sort of a large number of vessels typically going to the North Atlantic in the early period of the industry. So yes, it was tried there. I think the English whaling companies I would compare to English trading companies like the East India Company. I think that was the economic model that they were following, whereas the American whaling corporations were something much more limited in scope and more closely resembled a traditional whaling voyage. But it's an interesting point, yeah.
Just one point about that, the British companies were subsidized by the government. So if they failed on a voyage, so what?
Yeah.
I mean, it was relatively unsuccessful, sort of across the board, especially the sperm whale fishery. It just didn't last. It did last. The bowhead fishery in the Eastern Arctic lasted for a lot longer, but it was largely government subsidized.
There's questions back up.
Okay, but my question is, do the corporations during the span of the industry, did they fall down to zero, or was there some experimentation where people would look at the problem of the incentives and try to modify the structure and create the incentives in the corporate structure, or use debt, or
That's right.
in some other way tinker with and create a hybrid?
So that's a really neat question. By the way, so there's a big drop in 1849. Anybody want to guess what that is? Yes. People, if you're a risk seeker, the discovery of gold in California is even more attractive than whaling. So lots of whaling was sort of paused, and many whaling voyages were abandoned, as you know. Now the question is, was there further experimentation? That's a very, very interesting question. I think if it had been pursued in that way, we could ultimately have seen some successful whaling corporations come out of that. But I think in response to significant losses, and at a time when things like the gold rush and other economic changes are happening, in these small ports, just whaling was abandoned. It wasn't just the corporate form, it's just they got out of whaling as they started to pursue other things. So nobody had an incentive to do that experimentation, but it would have been wonderful to see the results of those experiments if they had been pursued.
What about other incentives of the corporation? So I've got all these people that want to come into the business, which seems to be a classic bubble. So we round up all this money, and we charge them fees, and they go build whaling ships, and they go hire crew, I can inject all this capital into the service side of the business, generate no return, but folks are still making money, right?
So the agents who are non-investors, typically, or not big investors, are not losing when the businesses fail, and they're getting paid a salary. So yes, they are earning good returns, and maybe one way to understand the decline of whaling is to just see that investors began to perceive that this is exactly what was happening and withdrew their capital, right? We're going to shut these businesses down. I'm tired of paying a salary to this guy who's just losing me money, raising capital with my money and not producing any solid returns from that. There's a question back here. Is that, yeah?
The ship builders.
Yes.
Did they simply sell their product, or did they roll the...
I think there's separate firms that are manufacturers of vessels. The whaling agents will purchase a vessel or maybe a commission a vessel's construction from them, but the agents are not in charge literally of building vessels. There are specialized vessel manufacturers that do that.
The shipbuilders themselves, they didn't take stakes in those vessels?
I don't know. It's possible that they could have, but I think often the case that the vessel's being sold to an agent who in turn sells shares to investors. Let me take one down here and then I'll get you. Yeah.
That's the age of the ship. That question. You noted that the average age was 50 years.
Yeah.
I'm sure the builder was far removed.
Right. That's a good point. Right. So the point made here is, 15, 20 years later, when this vessel is still at sea, it's unlikely that those initial builders of the vessel continue to be the owners. There's a question up here.
Well, there also was an aspect of, just finding the whales, given that the voyages went on for years.
Right.
And so in the partnership form, how do you think the fraternal nature of, this community influenced the outcomes?
So I think that one of the reasons that whaling was specialized in a few ports was exactly because those ports created a community where people are sharing information, where your status in the community is related to your success in the business. Like a successful captain coming home, he's going to become socially prominent there. And that does add a layer of incentives for the voyages to go well. But having said that, think about these corporations. They're being formed by, in some cases, civic activists who are going through a great deal of trouble to get a bill passed in the legislature for a law, bringing everyone from the community together as investors, sometimes small investors, and trying to pursue it. So they face these huge disadvantages, but at the same time, they do have very powerful social incentives to do well. It's embarrassing that these whaling corporations were failures after, in some cases around the time of their formation. You see these long editorials in the local newspaper about how great this is going to be, how it's going to transform the local economy, how the people founding it are such great business leaders and so on, and the whole thing tanks. So those community incentives do exist. It's just they lack the sort of depth of knowledge that comes from a specialized whaling port. Yep.
Do you have any idea if the American firms that relocate some of their ships abroad to Canada, to Wales, to Nova Scotia, did the form of organization change over time for those areas as well, or did it reflect what was traditional here in the U.S.?
So I should say I don't exactly know the answer to that question. So I know that many of the whaling merchants on Nantucket were loyalists and fled to Canada, and there were other episodes where Americans were sort of brought to different countries to sort of stimulate the creation of a whaling business where it didn't exist, or to give it a shot in the arm or something like that. I think that they, all I can tell you is anecdotal stories that I've heard. I think that they're trying to replicate the business methods that they brought with them, and they were encouraged to do that, but I don't know to what extent they might have innovated or responded to local conditions in different ways. So I can't give you a great answer to that. Absolutely right. And what you're suggesting is the key to success is identifying exactly the right people to be running your whaling voyage for you, to whom you're going to be delegating all this authority. And so my claim is, if you have managers who are just getting paid a salary, they don't work that hard to figure out who the right people are to hire to run your voyage and handle all that responsibility for you.
We're going to have to cut it off there. I'm sorry. Eric, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.